no mystery that The Substance has become one of the most talked about horror movies of the year. It seemingly came out of nowhere. And it's just become one of those flash in the pan things that sparked a lot of discussion. And I think it's for a good reason. When I was watching it, I kind of compared it to Get Out. It's one of those movies that unpacks a lot of social commentary, and it deals with prevalent or relatable issues, but it also kind of just does that thing where it dials it all the way up to the most extreme scenario, as most horror movies do, and makes it just an insane body horror movie. I'm late to the party talking about it, but I still wanted to, because it feels like one of those generation-defining horror movies. And although this movie is batshit insane, it doesn't lose sight of the message at the end of the day. If anything, the horror actually kind of furthers it. What it really does is it kind of just uses the horror to explore the themes that it's kind of trying to delve into. The ideas of aging, clinging to relevancy, and taking away from tomorrow by living for short-sighted goals are all ultimately the meat of the horror that happens in The Substance. And not only is the horror great, but also the performances. I'm sure you've heard about Dennis Quaid's great scumbag performance in this movie. He just dials it up. He just goes full Harvey Weinstein in this movie, basically. Just such a scumbag. Plays it so well as just a greedy fuck. But obviously the actual bones of the movie are made up by Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley's performances. They both bring great dimension to this character, especially Demi Moore, and they show the different ways that they engage in self-loathing and indulgence. Also just that excessive behavior that comes from these very different experiences. And that also goes into my thoughts on the social commentary itself, because it really does strike the right balance. Pretty much the biggest fault and issue that most Hollywood movies tend to make is that they have a hard time exploring social commentary in a way that isn't condescending or really on the nose. And this really wasn't the case with The Substance. They accurately portrayed a social issue, its causes, effects, and ultimately the consequences, without having to lecture the audience or talk down to them, and I give them major credit for that. Not only that, but the major subject matter of the movie is very upsetting to a certain degree, and they found ways to bathe in that with horrific consequences when tackling the issues that it does. I watched it last night, and it's just one of those movies that I can't stop thinking about. I surprisingly want to give it another watch already, which, I wouldn't have thought that, especially when you consider that the movie is almost 2.5 hours long. But the thing is, it really doesn't feel like it's runtime at all. You don't feel that 2.5 hours. It just finds new and interesting ways to keep you very much engaged in the story, the characters, the way that this substance works, the consequences of what happens when you don't obey the rules, what happens when different scenarios play out. The movie knows the right way to approach that, and it keeps it all relevant. There's no fat to this movie, which is very surprising given its runtime. You wouldn't think that there would be that much to tell with what is pretty much, at its bones, a pretty simple story. There is a version of this movie that probably could have just been 90 minutes, but I never felt like this movie never told anything that it didn't need to tell, didn't give information it didn't need to give. Everything had a purpose, everything added to the story. I genuinely, if someone asked me, I don't think I would cut anything out. It's all part of the overall experience. But not only that, going back to the performances, you get that time with this character in a way where they could express a full range of emotions, especially when switching back and forth between her younger self and her older self. You genuinely do get that full scope, which you couldn't have got if this movie was 90 minutes. And the thing is, if this movie was 90 minutes, I could see where that more generic, sanitized Hollywood version of this movie would come out, would be less intelligent, would probably be more preachy, and would just be much more of a surface level look at this issue and of this social commentary, and I don't think that it would have cut through at all if it did that. Not to mention that this movie also has incredible practical effects. For the most part, there's a lot of parts where I couldn't even tell if it was digital CGI augmented, but I think most of it was overall practical. Just in general, there are several layers of this movie that I find incredibly interesting, engaging. It comes from both character, but also just the premise is both very simplistic, but also captivating. It also gives a lot of options for what you could tell about this character. Gives you the ability to see very different sides of her, but also in a way where you get to see how this desperation for fame drives her to do some crazy things, and how when she's living these different lives. She just has incredibly different priorities. It's just a super engaging experience. I really was a big fan of it, and I'm glad that I checked it out finally. And I wanted to get my thoughts out there. Like I said, it's one of those experiences where I felt kind of similarly with Longlegs. The more time that passed, when I walked away, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I just feel excited to talk about it, discuss it more. I think it's definitely safe to say it'll crack my top 10 movies of the year when I do that at the end. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. I'd love to hear, not to shill, but I also have memberships if you want to become a member. There's different perks to it. You can become part of GM Light's army, GM Light squad, whichever you want. Anything is appreciated. I'm GM Light. Have a good one.